now say that the Red Bull domination era is over? I mean, Max is saying it. It's not just some random guy on a ladder. Oh wait, that's me. And remember, I said the end of domination, and also reminds us all how good Max truly is. However, we have to definitely start with Lando Norris and how this race has truly been the next phase of him emerging as Lando Prime. Shirt available on my merch store, by the way. He is now second place in the championship. We have a McLaren runner-up, and I can't tell you how long it's been since we've had a McLaren driver all the way up there. And listening to the commentators, based on what happened at the beginning of the race, Lando needed to be within 4 seconds to really show that the MCL38 was just as good as the RB20, but at the same time, Lando and McLaren became so obsessed with that fact that they fell prey to it, that they became far too obsessed with Max Verstappen's rear end. Yes, I understand. Having a chance to ravish a Red Bull's backside is quite a juicy prospect, but you've got to control yourself, Lando. Control yourself. Nevertheless, the attitude shift is certainly a positive side to see, with him and the team keen to try bolder strategies, which almost work. I think we can safely say that the McLaren dark age that has been around since the end of 2012, it's well and truly over. McLaren are back, baby. They are now going for wins and podiums like there was no tomorrow, and like it's back in the days of the 2000s. And we all thought that Ferrari were going to be joining them and thought it would be a really true old school showing. But no, Ferrari have dropped the ball lately, but hopefully they'll come back because it was nice to have that nostalgic twist. One thing is for sure though, Lando Norris can sense victory, and he can sense it far more frequently than he did last year. And we are going to Spielberg next week, or technically this week, it's Rostock again, and this is one of Lando Norris's beast tracks. That's the place where he got the nickname Last Lap Lando. But you can't deny that McLaren did let that victory slip through their fingers by just a tiny bit. There are a lot of little things that just got in the way. There was, of course, Lando's start. There were slipstreaming factors being overly powerful down the straights, George Russell to contend with as well, but we don't blame George solely, no. And then, of course, there's something to do with the pit stop. 3.6 seconds. That would have easily put Max Verstappen right in front of him in DRS potentially at the end of the race. Sure, Lando does still need some work to be truly a championship contender. But the fact is, though, is that he has now had a victory, he's had multiple second places, and now he can actually give Max Verstappen a proper challenge. Something that we saw in bits and pieces at the end of last year. But now it's well and truly there, where he has to make Max Verstappen hustle and really try. And Lando himself is far more accomplished than he was 12 months ago. Okay, he is beating himself up quite a lot, but in a way, he's changed it into a manner where it's a little bit more constructive. Like, he knows he can win. We know he can win, technically. But I'm just glad it's now coming this year rather than in 2 years' time. There's no more waiting around. And it also goes to show that Red Bull are now heavily relying on the natural talent and grit of Max Verstappen. The Dutchman is an absolute machine. Let's be real. This is going to be the year where we are reminded just how awesome Max is as a driver in his own right, when a car is not quite good enough to give him utter domination. With a team that has just as good of a car as McLaren, if not just that slightly bit better to give Max Verstappen that teensiest little bit of an edge, we can now see the natural talent on display from Max Verstappen, and something that we are not seeing from the likes of Sergio Perez. We can easily say, and even he says, that at Montreal, it was a very fortunate victory. And I would say here, it was also a very fortunate victory. If you can get Max Verstappen out in the front, he can dictate the race. He knows exactly what he has to do. It's why he's won over 60 Grand Prix. The difference is that someone else can dictate the race. That's when things get a little bit dicey. Fortunately, the Circuit de Catalunya is light on curbs in terms of overall reliance, so it did give the RB20 a little bit of a break. But yeah, George and Lando scrapping for second place again, that definitely saved Max's bacon. There was good fortune, and the upgrades that Red Bull did bring concerning the floor and side pod entries were very important, since they were needed. I will chuck Red Bull a bone here and say that their pit stops probably gave Max a bit more wiggle room too, since their rivals had either major errors or sluggish standard stops. All of those maladies and Red Bull's consistently good fortune, especially with that sub 2 second pit stop, were enough to keep Max out in front and not have to worry about DRS from Lando. We are now starting to see Max Verstappen using more of his racecraft to try and win a race, instead of having a car where he can just cruise to victory and not have to worry about things at all. He now has to use much more of his power, and we are going to have a lot of fun seeing that. Then there's Alpine. You know what? Given all the flack hurled their way, especially from me, this was a genuinely great race for the team. Sure, it ended up with P9 and P10 again, but there were times when Gasly looked like he could genuinely get 7th place, and in qualifying, both of them got into Q3 without any luck coming their way. This seems like it's a very good circuit for that car, which does hold some hope for that team, for the fact that the Circuit de Catalunya is a very neutral track and very beneficial for many teams since the team has so much data, as do the other 9 teams. So if you can be good around Barcelona, there is a good chance that if you can get over some of the problems that the car has, you could have a fairly solid car at any circuit. They just need to sort out their weight problems, as well as actually, bring some upgrades to their car, since apparently there are none coming anytime soon, and Ocon and Gasly are now having to share a chassis which is slightly heavier than the other one. There aren't many things going in Alpine's direction, but thankfully, they've now been starting to score regularly. They scored in Monaco, they scored in Canada, and now they scored here. 3 races on the trot. And as a result, it's now seen them leapfrog Haas into 7th place in the Constructors. And if you just looked at the positions where Alpine was, 6th from last year, 7th this year, you think, oh, their decline's not that bad, they'll get back there. Well, at one point they were dead last, but thankfully they're not there anymore. Something's clicked. I don't know whether it's the presence of Flavio Briatore or something, making them really try harder, or maybe Ocon and Gasly have managed to put things aside. I don't know what's been going on, since there are no upgrades. It's just, it worked today. But out of the 2 drivers, Gasly was the stronger of the 2 in both qualifying and the race, but Ocon certainly didn't disgrace himself. Then Mercedes, they are definite winners today. Sure, it's not as good as the result they got last year, but given the struggles of the W15 in the first third of 2024, this is a far better result than anybody could have expected, even just a month ago. Hamilton securing his first Grand Prix podium of the season. Remember, he had a sprint podium earlier on in China. I mean, at least I remember, not the Mercedes admin. They can now thankfully just step aside from all the sabotage allegations. Now it's being brought to the police. And quite frankly, Toto will be glad that it's all over and that Charles Leclerc and Ferrari will have to put up with all of that nonsense. But either way, Mercedes have managed to claw back something. They've got upgrades that are working. The correlation issue that they were having at the beginning of the year seems to have been sorted out. And now they are in a position where they are slightly faster than Ferrari. Their race pace is pretty solid. And I mean, wow. I never thought that a W15 could pull off that move that George did, but I'll talk about that in a moment. Hamilton himself seemed really composed. This will probably do him the world of good that he can get podiums, and he's just one step closer to being the only driver to have scored over 200 podiums. The pit stops, when they weren't messing up George's pit stops, were actually pretty solid, and it's a far improvement from what they were doing last year when most of their pit stops were nearly 3 seconds or over 3 seconds, and that could easily help them if they wish to think that 3rd place in the Constructors is doable. It's a lot more doable than it was even just 2 Grand Prix ago. Ferrari are dropping the bag when it comes to race pace, and Mercedes are not doing that. They could close that gap, and before we know it, we might have a situation where Mercedes aren't all that bad. It's not quite right seeing Mercedes being that far back and Aston Martin almost seeing them as their prey. That's not that anymore. And then we've just got to talk about, of course, Hamilton having a good race, George Russell. Now, that is far more like it. I wanted to put George in his own section here, not to show favouritism, but to illustrate that this race has helped alleviate some of the concerns that were brought up in Canada. The only mistake I really saw from him that caused significant damage to his race was simply the pit stop, and that wasn't his fault. We've got to talk about the 2 major highlights of that race. Him going from 4th place to 1st by turn 1. That is exactly what Checo hoped to do at the Mexican Grand Prix last year, but even harder. 5th place for Checo would have been roughly on the same line that he was, but George had to go past Lewis, around the outside of Lando and Max, and then bag it around the outside. No one was expecting that. Not Max, not Lando, not anybody. Sure, he had to relinquish the lead by lap 2 or 3, but the fact that that audacious move even happened, and it got him from 4th to 2nd for a while, that was absolutely amazing and flawless. And then, that half-lap battle with Lando. That was superb. Probably one of the best battles of the season, if not in recent memory. It was clean, it was professional, and they both had fun, and Lando had to be really pushed to get past Russell and go onto the grass. That got really spicy, and both men were able to keep it pointing straight. This was far more slick and polished than we've seen from Russell in past races, and if he's learning that quickly, then I don't think Mercedes have got anything to worry about. This was absolutely brilliant, and far more that we should be seeing from Russell. And if the car's going to improve, we might see more of it. Sure, he unfortunately didn't get the chance to go for the podium because this time around, he was not on the optimal tyre strategy. Lewis got that plum because they thought that the hards were okay, and they were initially okay. I mean, George got a couple of fastest laps, but it was quite clear that they were very slippery and not quite right for the track then it had been rubbered in. That the softs were the ones to go on for the lighter cars, and if he can just have more of these races and not races like Canada or Singapore last year, then maybe we might be onto a solid team leader when Antonelli comes on board, most likely. Unless, of course, they bag Max Verstappen for 2026, in which case George Russell is pretty much done at Mercedes, but I don't really want to think about that right now because that's completely unfortunate. I don't think Toto's going to let Max Verstappen get away a second time if he can get the opportunity. Sorry, George. Now, I was umming and ahhing about putting Piastri in the winners section, but I am just about going to put him here because of something that the commentators were not spotting. During the final stint of the race, Piastri, we all thought, was going to be like 8th or something like that. 15 seconds behind Carlos Sainz. But then, the soft tyres were starting to work with Piastri. And by the end of the race, he had managed to drop about 12 seconds and was within 2 or 3 seconds of Carlos and could have taken 6th place, completely eviscerating the gap between them, which was almost a pit stop in length. That is a really good measure of tyre deg. And when you look at charts provided by F1 Big Data, the tyre degradation compared from Norris to Piastri isn't all that much. The tyre management from Oscar at this Grand Prix, when the temperatures were extremely hot and the softs just completely melted, is commendable. And yeah, we do have to talk about the element in the room here, qualifying, where he did make a mistake, and even then, he wasn't expecting miracles. He wasn't expecting much more time. He might have maybe been 7th or 8th or maybe 6th if he was lucky, and he then ended up 10th, and he had it all to do. He did manage to pick up a couple of positions at the beginning of the race, which is good, but it could have been that little bit more, which would have really brought McLaren much closer toward Ferrari, especially since Ferrari are having a little bit of a mardy right now with their drivers, whereas with Oscar and Lando, it's looking fine. For now. If we can see more of Oscar improving near the end of the race, then Lando's got himself a very potent teammate, and have something that Mercedes and Ferrari seem to be lacking at the moment. Who knows? We might actually see McLaren, by the end of the season, make a solid push for the Constructors' title. Now that would be bonkers amazing. Then we get to the meh section and Ferrari. Where on earth has that race pace gone? And where's the harmony gone? Sure, it's not the worst race pace out there. They're still within the top 4 teams, but they are the slowest of the top 4 teams. And that is not something that we've been seeing at the beginning of the season. They were almost up there with Red Bull. They were almost on them. And then with these upgrades, Imola was okay. But they brought a lot of stuff for the Spanish Grand Prix to make sure they didn't waste any time during the Austrian sprint weekend, which is a good idea. But it didn't really translate into anything. Sure, it's far better than we saw in Canada. They made it to Q3, and Leclerc was close to getting 4th place, but the Mercedes have somehow been able to leapfrog them just about, and actually do better when it comes to overall race pace. And that just happened out of nowhere. And sure, hopefully Ferrari will actually be able to get on top of it, but right now, they're not exactly doing all that well. Not to mention for the fact that we are starting to see some issues when it comes to pit stop strategy. Because on the radio, Leclerc was lambasting his pit crew by going, "Why are we still on plan A?" And then they said, well, everyone else is doing it. Well, look at McLaren. They were completely going against the grain and it almost worked out for them. Ferrari had to do something bold to get past the Mercedes and they weren't doing that. And then, of course, we had Carlos Sainz on the radio complaining, saying he should get penalty. Talk about the rule book. Rants about rule books and what's the point of having them? Yeah, exactly. It was just completely not in the right mindset for either driver. And then let's just talk about the drivers themselves. I mean, I thought that Carlos and Charles were a really solid unit. Sure, last year we saw a couple of spats, especially Monza 2023 with the #NoRisk situation. But we got situations where they did touch and they were complaining about one another. And then at the end of the race, Charles was completely bamboozled, thinking that Carlos was trying to make himself look good for his future employer, to try and do something sensational. And then Carlos says that, oh, he's always complaining at the end of the race. And you think, oh, that's gone sour. And that's probably a subject for an entire video, but this is not good for Ferrari, and Fred needs to stamp this out immediately. And it seems to be the source of Carlos Sainz, and given the fact that the whole situation with his contract's gone on for so long, my estimation of him right now has completely diminished. I used to really like this guy, but now I'm not so sure. He's just really disappointing me, quite frankly. And I know that he wants to find himself a race seat for next year, but it's just dragged on for so long. And then there's the complete disconnect between Sainz and Hamilton, when Hamilton was thinking, oh, I had a pretty good race, it was fun. And then Sainz was going, no, it wasn't, he didn't see the whole thing. And then he was complaining about Hamilton as well. Ugh. Carlos, stop. Did it work with Piastri in Miami? No, it didn't. Then there's Nico Hülkenberg. Yes, 11th place again, and Alpine have managed to get one over Haas again to overtake them in the Constructors. But Nico is managing to provide some hope for the team and be less than 10 seconds behind points. You know, for a quiet weekend for Haas, I think they're really going to miss the guy. He has been providing them a lot of hopeful performances, which almost gives them a point or two. And so far this season, it's been okay that they get P11s because Alpine were nowhere. But now they are starting to get somewhere, and Haas are now back down to 8th. And if they don't get a wriggle on and start bringing upgrades now that Alpine is starting to respond and having a couple of good weekends, they might not get 7th place, because for 7th place for Haas would be an absolute boon for them. And it's quite telling that there's not much going on at Haas at the moment, especially since Magnussen is just not doing anything special. You know when Sky Sports talks to team principals when they're in their garage and they come back to them maybe 3 or 4 times during the Grand Prix? I believe they only went to Komatsu once because there was so little that was making Haas relevant in the race. That just tells you a lot. And sure, it's a safe 8th place in the Constructors, because I don't think Sauber's going to be scoring anytime soon, and Williams, they've got their own problems right now, but still, they shouldn't be settling for 8th place. But then, after many races near the back and the car being incredibly fragile, Zhou's decision on his part to go back to an earlier version of the C44 chassis has turned out to be the right call, with Zhou Guanyu looking like the stronger of the 2 Sauber drivers, and now starting to emulate the results that we were getting in Bahrain and Jeddah, where he was very, very close to scoring points, and it might have actually saved Sauber's bacon, because right now, they've got bupkis when it comes to points, whereas really they should be having 3 or 4 right now, but due to reliability, and of course their pit stop woes, it's not really translated. But now, there's something about that old chassis which agrees with Zhou Guanyu that the new one didn't. And maybe Bottas might revert to that as well, because they've combined it with a couple of new upgrades, say for the rear wing, with that old chassis, and it just works. And quite frankly, Sauber need to get this, because otherwise they are going to be plumb last. But just watch for a later video in the week to find out why I probably think they don't care, and I think they're just going to ride it out with Sauber and let them take the flak. But hey, at least Sauber are not 17th or 18th. Then we get to the losers and Racing Bulls. Oh dear, we are starting to see a trend here that bringing a boatload of upgrades doesn't always translate to results. Going from a position where you were the 5th or 6th fastest team to being the 2nd slowest team, only Williams slower than you and only by a gnat's hair? Oh, that's a climb down. But the only crumb of comfort I can see, aside from the fact that Tsunoda was almost plumb last, was that Ricciardo was the stronger of the two. Okay, he ended up 15th, and they both were out in Q1, but oh, that's something. So long as Daniel Ricciardo's happy and he feels okay with the car, then hopefully that might improve his lot, and when the car does come back to them, he might score a little bit more often and maybe get their campaign for 6th place back on the road again. Because it's quite clear that Yuki Tsunoda was not feeling this Grand Prix, and the 3-stop strategy that he was on clearly was not going to work. And Daniel, yeah, he was the more settled of the two. I just don't understand what's going on this year. Maybe it's down to the fact that diminishing returns are an actual thing, and that maybe these upgrades don't always work. That just because you bring an upgrade doesn't guarantee it that it'll work right out of the gate, because, you know, you're chasing every single microsecond, and then sometimes it might lead you down the wrong path. It could easily happen to Red Bull, it could happen to any team. And it seems to have happened with Racing Bulls, Aston Martin, you name it. And I will name Aston Martin and the losers as well, because you know things are getting bad when not only Alonso says that the car is getting worse, and you are the 3rd slowest car, and Alonso's best prediction for you is 8th place and his worst prediction is 12th, and then he gets the worst prediction right, and then on top of that, they have a completely anonymous race where they are barely seen making overtakes. In fact, most of the time you see them, they are either battling for 14th with Bottas, or they are being lapped. And most of the time, it's Stroll being seen to be lapped. And then, of course, you got Lance being reprimanded for failing to do fan engagements or something. Since when was he engaging with fans? And then decided to emulate Sebastian Vettel from 2017 and tap Lewis to show his disapproval for impeding him. But then again, this being Lance Stroll, I don't know whether he was doing that out of anger or simply for the fact that he changed his line, and while he was complaining, he actually just sort of went over to the side and tapped Lewis without him realizing it, due to the fact that he lacks observational skills, as we've seen throughout the years. I don't know what to think anymore, because Lance, that was not a good look, on top of you not doing what you're supposed to be doing and engaging with the fans when you're supposed to. Whatever the case, Aston Martin only got noticed by the media because of a lack of performance or a lack of conduct. And they did bring updates. We're starting to see 2023 spiral happening all over again, aren't we? Then there is Williams. That's just a messy weekend. Not only did Albon's Parc Ferme have to be broken to try and fix some situations with the car, as well as change the setup a little bit, but Logan had that 3-place grid penalty which took him from 20th to 19th, bizarrely, because of Albon. And yeah, they were completely nowhere. Sargent didn't even get close to 19th, he just seemed completely lost and absent. Far less like than the Sargent that we saw who got into Q2 and got the 13th and nearly outqualified Albon. And I don't know what's been going on behind the scenes, but I think it's not good. But one thing is for sure though, Williams were the slowest team at the Circuit de Catalunya, and even though they were aware of this, I don't think they were expecting to be this slow. They were quite close to propping up the table, the classification, since there were no retirements, only for the fact that Tsunoda did a 3-stop and it clearly didn't work out for him, so yeah, not much else to say about Williams. But then there was plenty of stuff to say about Sergio Perez. Okay, he got into Q3 this time, but the sheer amount of deflecting Christian Horner had to do in interviews, he must be having to fend off so many internal arguments regarding Perez given this weekend. He had to resort to commending Sergio Perez's fantastic last lap overtake on Pierre Gasly. Yeah, an Alpine being overtaken by a Red Bull. That should not be news. That should be just a given, especially given Alpine's current circumstances. Perez should have been doing better, and I know he had a 3-place grid penalty, so he was compromised. He might have done better had he started in 8th place like he was supposed to, and he did score a couple of points, but the truth is, though, is that the RB20 should be doing better than that. And Verstappen is showing us quite clearly that RB20 needs him to get the most out of it, and Perez simply can't do it. I don't know what the team's doing, that the upgrades that they are bringing are just affecting Perez in some way, just to the betterment of Max Verstappen so he can get the most out of it, because it's quite clear that if they keep this up and Perez keeps struggling, not only are they going to get more and more criticism for the fact they kept this driver, but they're also probably going to lose the Constructors' title. But do you think Red Bull are actually that bothered about it, given the fact that, really, the World Drivers' title is a little bit more important and Max Verstappen wants it more? Because, yeah, they got the Constructors last year, but I don't know with this team. They are not acting like they are supposed to. Sure, Sergio did fade into the background when he tried a 3-stop strategy as well. That worked wonders for Yuki. That wasn't enough to get past anybody ahead of him. Because the whole point of a 3-stop strategy is that you don't have to pay too much mind to the tyre. You can just rip it to shreds, go all out, get past people, overtake people. But right now, overtaking in these cars, even for an RB20, is quite difficult. Although the MCL38, I mean, they were just overtaking people like crazy. It was mad. I mean, going around the outside, around turn 3 and turn 4, wow. But according to Checo, that was the best he could do. And with McLaren catching up and being the only team to have scored in every race and only 30 points behind nearest rivals Ferrari, Red Bull are going to have to rely on Max more and more to make up the difference, unless some upgrades work for both drivers. But given the situation where Red Bull are looking to appease Max more and not really paying much mind to Checo really needs to step up and get his head around this car, because they might lose and either Ferrari or McLaren might come out as the victors. Sure, they might not be going down to 3rd place, but, you know, things could happen. But are Red Bull bothered about this? Well, yes and no. It's hard to say. It's clearly a mess in terms of team dynamics, and if we see more examples of Verstappen excelling and Perez floundering, Horner might have to make a mid-season swap to ensure that Team Discord doesn't reach an uncomfortable level. Which could be a great opportunity for Yuki given his early season performances and overall maturity this year, something I tackle in this video here that you can go watch right now. Checo may have that contract, but if he keeps this up, then his career could be contracted.